December 1941. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of a small photography studio in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across walls lined with portraits of smiling families, graduates in caps and gowns, and young couples frozen in moments of joy. But for 32-year-old Margaret Eleanor Hayes, that Tuesday morning would mark the end of one life and the beginning of another she never asked for, never wanted, and could never have imagined. Margaret stood behind her counter, her hands trembling slightly as she developed the last set of wedding photographs she would process for nearly 4 years. The chemical smell of the darkroom clung to her clothes, a scent she had grown to love over the past decade. Her father's gray-fleck Speed graphic camera, the one he had used to document the Great War, sat on the shelf behind her, its brass fittings dull with age, its leather bellows cracked and worn. Everyone told her to upgrade, to get one of the modern cameras flooding the market. But that camera was all she had left of him, and she refused to let it go. The radio crackled in the corner, playing Glenn Miller's orchestra, when suddenly the music stopped. What followed were words that would change everything. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. America was at war. Margaret's hands froze over the developing tray. Her younger brother, Thomas, was stationed at Hickam Field. Her mind raced through possibilities she didn't want to consider, through images of fire and destruction she couldn't yet comprehend. The photograph in her hands, a young bride and groom smiling at each other with infinite hope, suddenly seemed like relics from another world, a world that had existed just hours ago, but was now gone forever. Now, before we continue with Margaret's story, I want to acknowledge something. I know our audience is made of intelligent and discerning people like you, people who appreciate depth research and stories that matter. If you value content that honors the real experiences of those who lived through history's darkest hours, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. We pour our hearts into bringing these forgotten voices back to life, and your support allows us to keep doing this important work. The weeks that followed Pearl Harbor transformed Washington, D.C. into a city Margaret barely recognized. Blackout curtains hung in every window. Air raid wardens patrolled the streets at night, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The Capitol building, that great symbol of democracy, was ringed with sandbags and armed guards. The cherry trees along the tidal basin, which had brought such beauty each spring, now seemed to mock the city with their promise of renewal in a world consumed by death. Margaret's studio, which had once been her sanctuary, became increasingly empty. Young men who had been her customers were shipping out to training camps. Families canceled portrait sessions, unable to afford luxuries when rationing made even basic necessities scarce. She should have been worried about her business, about how she would pay rent, about her future. But all she could think about was Thomas. The telegram came on a Friday afternoon in January. Thomas was alive, wounded but recovering. Relief flooded through her so intensely that her knees buckled, and she had to sit down on the cold floor of her studio, the yellow paper clutched in her hands. But mixed with that relief was something else, something she was ashamed to acknowledge: guilt. She was safe here, behind her camera, while her brother and millions of others faced horrors she couldn't begin to imagine. It was this guilt that made her respond when the recruitment officer came to her studio in February 1942. He was looking for photographers, he said, people with technical skills who could serve the war effort. Margaret assumed he meant documenting bond drives, taking portraits of servicemen before they shipped out, creating propaganda posters. She said yes immediately, grateful for a chance to contribute, to feel less useless. She could never have known that this simple decision would lead her into a world of shadows and deception, where nothing was as it seemed and everyone was a potential enemy. The orientation took place in a nondescript government building on Constitution Avenue. Margaret arrived expecting to meet other photographers, perhaps receive training on military protocols for documentation. Instead, she was led to a small, windowless room where a man who introduced himself only as Colonel Richardson sat across from her at a bare metal table. He studied her in silence for a long moment, his eyes sharp and calculating. Then he slid a photograph across the table. It showed a group of military officers at what appeared to be a formal dinner, their uniforms crisp, their expressions jovial. Margaret looked at it, confused about what she was supposed to see. "Notice anything unusual?" Colonel Richardson asked. Margaret studied the image more carefully. The lighting, the composition, the subjects, everything seemed ordinary. She shook her head. "The man third from the left," Richardson said, pointing. 3 days after this photograph was taken, he disappeared. 2 weeks later, we intercepted communications indicating that classified documents had been passed to German intelligence. Documents that only someone with his level of clearance could have access. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "You think he was a spy?" "We know he was." Richardson leaned back in his chair. "What we don't know is who else might be compromised. Miss Hayes, we have reason to believe that Nazi intelligence has successfully placed operatives within various levels of Allied command, not just here in Washington, but throughout our military structure. These people don't look like spies. They have perfect credentials, impeccable backgrounds. They've spent years, sometimes decades, building their cover identities. They're invisible, except in one crucial way." He tapped the photograph. "They have to meet their handlers. They have to pass information. And when they do, when they gather together, there are patterns. Behavioral tells that the trained eye can spot, but only if someone is looking, and only if that someone appears completely harmless, completely beyond suspicion." Margaret began to understand. "You want me to photograph them?" "Not exactly." Richardson pulled out another file. "We want you to photograph everything. Social events, military gatherings, bond rallies, USO shows, anywhere that military personnel and government officials congregate. We'll give you press credentials, access to locations most civilians never see. Your job will be to document these events as any photographer would, but you'll also be trained to recognize certain signs, certain behaviors that might indicate enemy activity. The camera you use, the techniques you employ, even your appearance will be carefully calculated to make you seem beneath notice. People dismiss what they think is harmless. And if I find something, then you'll save lives. Potentially thousands of them. Operation Torch is being planned as we speak. Miss Hayes, the invasion of North Africa. If the enemy knows our plans, our troops will walk into a slaughter. We cannot allow that to happen." Margaret thought of Thomas, recovering from his wounds, likely to be sent back into combat as soon as he was fit. She thought of all the young men who had passed through her studio, their whole lives ahead of them. She thought of her father, who had documented one war and come home changed, haunted by what he had seen. "What do I need to do?" she asked. The training was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. For 3 weeks, she reported to the anonymous building on Constitution Avenue, where she learned skills she never knew existed. How to photograph in low light without a flash. How to use reflections and shadows to capture images without being obvious. How to read body language, to spot the micro-expressions that indicated deception or nervousness. How to memorize faces, to recognize the same person in different contexts, in different disguises. But more than that, she learned how to be invisible, how to dress in ways that made people's eyes slide past her, how to position herself in rooms, so that she seemed to be part of the background, just another woman with a camera documenting events that important men believed were beneath their notice. She learned that the best spies weren't the glamorous figures of pulp novels, but ordinary people who understood that invisibility was the greatest weapon of all. Her father's old Graflex camera, the one everyone had told her to replace, became her greatest asset. It was bulky, old-fashioned, the kind of camera a hobbyist or amateur might use. Nothing like the sleek modern equipment that professional photographers carried. When people saw her with it, they dismissed her immediately. Just a woman with her dead father's camera, playing at being a photographer. Let her take her pictures. She's harmless. They had no idea that the camera had been extensively modified, that its seemingly old-fashioned design had advanced optics that could capture clear images in conditions that would defeat most modern equipment, that Margaret had been trained to use every feature, every capability, to document things that others wanted to remain hidden. Her first assignment came in March 1942, a reception at the Mayflower Hotel for officers involved in strategic planning. Margaret arrived early, dressed in a modest gray dress that made her blend into the elegant wallpaper, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and cigar smoke. Military uniforms mixed with evening gowns, and the chatter was bright and false, everyone pretending that the world wasn't burning. Margaret moved through the room like a ghost, taking photographs of smiling groups, of handshakes and toasts, of all the expected moments. But she was also watching, observing, noting who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who seemed nervous or uncomfortable. Her training had taught her to see beyond the surface, to recognize the patterns that others missed. It was nearly midnight when she noticed him, a lieutenant colonel standing near the bar, his uniform perfect, his posture military precise. But his eyes were wrong. They moved constantly, scanning the room with an intensity that didn't match his casual pose. And when a civilian in an expensive suit approached him, the colonel's entire body language changed. Just for a moment, just a flicker, but Margaret saw it. Recognition, followed by immediate suppression of that recognition. She raised her camera, adjusting the settings as if she were simply taking another group shot. The shutter clicked, capturing the moment when the colonel and the civilian stood together, their faces in profile, the tension between them visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The civilian passed the colonel a matchbook, a simple gesture, the kind of thing that happened 1,000 times a night in a room full of smokers. But the colonel didn't smoke. Margaret had been watching him for 20 minutes, and he hadn't touched a cigarette once. She took 3 more photographs, varying her angles, making it seem as if she were simply documenting the general atmosphere of the event. Then she moved away, her heart pounding, her hand steady on the camera despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The next morning, she delivered her film to the address Colonel Richardson had given her. 3 days later, she was called back to the anonymous building on Constitution Avenue. Richardson was waiting, and this time he was smiling. The matchbook contained a microfilm, he said. Naval deployment schedules for the Atlantic Fleet. The lieutenant colonel has been placed under surveillance. The civilian was arrested this morning attempting to board a neutral Swedish freighter. Miss Hayes, you may have just prevented a devastating U-boat attack. Margaret should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt sick. The lieutenant colonel had a wife. She had seen her photograph on his desk in one of her shots. Children, probably a life that was about to be destroyed because he had chosen to betray his country. How many people had he sent to their deaths with the information he had passed? How many ships had been sunk? How many sailors drowned in cold Atlantic waters? Because of him. I need you to understand something, Richardson said, his voice serious. What you're doing, it's not glamorous. It's not exciting. It's witnessing betrayal and knowing that the consequences of that betrayal are measured in body counts. If you want to stop, if this is too much, tell me now. No one will think less of you. Margaret thought about her brother Thomas, about all the men and women in uniform who trusted that their superiors weren't leading them into traps, that their secrets were safe, that someone was protecting them from the enemies within. She thought about her father, who had come home from the Great War and told her that the worst wounds weren't the ones you could see, but the ones that came from betrayal, from discovering that the men you trusted had sold you out. No, she said, I want to continue. And so she did. Through the spring and summer of 1942, Margaret became a fixture at military and government social events throughout Washington, the woman with the old camera, always in the background, always seemingly focused on nothing important. She photographed bond rallies and USO shows, formal dinners and informal gatherings. She smiled and nodded and made herself invisible while her camera captured everything. She identified 3 more potential operatives by August. A State Department official who had secret meetings with a supposed neutral diplomat, a Navy clerk who was passing information through a bookstore owner who specialized in rare German texts, a civilian contractor who was photographing military installations under the guise of documenting defense industry achievements. Each discovery meant lives saved, attacks prevented, secrets kept safe. But it also meant lives destroyed, families torn apart, the discovery that people who seemed trustworthy were anything but. Margaret learned to live with the weight of that knowledge, to carry the burden of seeing too much, knowing too much, understanding just how fragile security really was. The weather turned cold as autumn arrived, and with it came new assignments. Margaret was sent to Camp Ritchie in Maryland, where military intelligence personnel were being trained. She photographed classes and training exercises, her presence so commonplace that people stopped noticing her after the first day. It was there, in a casual conversation with an instructor, that she first heard about Operation Torch, the planned invasion of North Africa. The operation was supposed to be top secret, but Margaret quickly realized that information about it was leaking. Too many people were talking about North Africa, about amphibious assault training, about the need for French-language specialists. The Germans would have to be blind not to see the signs, unless they were getting more specific information from someone inside the planning structure. Back in Washington, Margaret began focusing her attention on the War Department, on the offices and meeting rooms where Operation Torch was being coordinated. She photographed everyone who had access to the planning documents, everyone who attended the strategy sessions, everyone who might have the information Germans would pay dearly for. It was tedious work, requiring endless patience. She spent hours in cold hallways, waiting for meetings to end so she could photograph people as they left. She attended dinners that lasted until midnight, standing in corners with her camera, watching and waiting. Her feet ached, her back hurt, and she was so tired that sometimes she felt like she was moving through a dream, disconnected from her own body. But she kept going, because she understood what was at stake. Operation Torch would be the first major American offensive of the war. If it failed, if the Germans were waiting for them, the political consequences could be devastating. The alliance with Britain might crack. Public support for the war could crumble. And thousands of young men like her brother Thomas, who had recovered and been reassigned to a unit preparing for deployment to North Africa, would die on beaches far from home. The breakthrough came in October, at a reception at the Army and Navy Club. Margaret was photographing a group of officers when she noticed something odd. A major she had seen at several previous events was standing near a window, his reflection visible in the glass. He was making small gestures with his hand, tapping his fingers against his leg in a pattern that seemed deliberate, almost like Morse code. Margaret shifted her position, pretending to adjust her camera settings while actually bringing the reflection into clearer focus. The major tapped again, and this time Margaret realized what he was doing. He was communicating with someone outside, someone she couldn't see through the window, but who must be watching from the street below. She took several photographs, capturing the major's reflection, the pattern of his movements, the precise timing of his gestures. Then she made her way to the window on the opposite side of the room, where she could photograph the street below without being obvious. There, standing in the shadows of a doorway across the street, was a man with binoculars, watching the window where the major stood. Margaret's hands were shaking now, but she kept her camera steady, taking photograph after photograph, documenting everything. The man in the doorway, the major at the window, the timing of their communication. Evidence that would be undeniable. When she delivered the film the next morning, Colonel Richardson called her into his office immediately. His face was grim. "This is bigger than we thought," he said. "Much bigger. The major you identified, he's part of the operational planning staff for Torch. He has access to embarkation schedules, transport routes, landing site selections. Everything the Germans would need to turn the invasion into a massacre. Can you arrest him?" Margaret asked. "Not yet. If we move too quickly, we'll alert the rest of the network. Because there's a network. Miss Hayes, one spy doesn't operate alone, not at this level. He's passing information to someone, who's passing it to someone else, who's ultimately getting it to German intelligence. We need to identify the entire chain. How long will that take?" Richardson's expression was troubled. "Torch is scheduled for early November. We have weeks, maybe less. We need you to photograph everything connected to this major. Everyone he talks to, everyone he meets with, every interaction he has. We need to map the entire network before they can do any more damage." The next 3 weeks were the most intense of Margaret's life. She shadowed the major whenever possible, photographing his meetings, his conversations, his movements throughout Washington. She barely slept, surviving on coffee and determination. Her world reduced to the view through her camera's lens. Slowly, the network began to reveal itself. The major passed information to a woman who worked as a secretary in the War Department. She passed it to her supposed boyfriend, a Portuguese national who worked at his country's embassy. He passed it to a bookkeeper who had connections to a German-American cultural society that was a front for intelligence operations. But there was more. As Margaret documented the network, she began to see connections to other people, other leaks, other operations. The network wasn't just focused on Operation Torch. It extended throughout the military and government, a spider's web of betrayal that had been years in the making. By the end of October, Margaret had identified 22 individuals who appeared to be part of the network. 22 people who had taken oaths to defend their country and had chosen to betray it instead. 22 people whose treachery could cost thousands of lives. The photographs she had taken filled an entire file room. Images of meetings and conversations, of secret exchanges and coded communications. Evidence of conspiracy that reached higher and deeper than anyone had imagined. Her father's old camera, the one everyone had dismissed as obsolete, had captured what more modern equipment never could. The truth hiding in plain sight. On November 2nd, 1942, 6 days before Operation Torch was scheduled to begin, Colonel Richardson gave the order. Simultaneous arrests across Washington, Maryland, and Virginia. 22 people taken into custody. Their network dismantled, their ability to pass information destroyed. Margaret watched from a distance as the major was arrested at his home in Arlington. He went quietly without protest, and she wondered what he was thinking. Did he regret his choices? Did he think about the lives he had endangered? Or was he simply a true believer, convinced that he had been serving a greater cause? She would never know. She wasn't allowed to attend the trials, wasn't allowed to see the evidence presented or hear the verdicts delivered. Her role in the investigation remained classified, known only to a handful of people. As far as the world was concerned, the spy ring had been uncovered through routine counterintelligence work. The woman with the old camera was never mentioned. Operation Torch launched on November 8, 1942. Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, facing resistance but not the slaughter that would have resulted if the Germans had known exactly where and when the invasion would occur. The operation wasn't perfect. There were casualties and setbacks, but it succeeded. The first step toward liberating Europe had been taken. Margaret listened to the news reports in her studio, tears streaming down her face. She thought about all the men landing on those beaches, including her brother Thomas, who was somewhere in that vast Allied force. She thought about the photographs she had taken, the secrets she had uncovered, the conspiracy she had helped dismantle. Had she really made a difference? Had her work really saved lives? She would never know for certain. That was the hardest part, the uncertainty. She couldn't calculate how many deaths she had prevented, couldn't measure the impact of her actions in any concrete way. All she could do was trust that it had mattered, that her sleepless nights and aching feet and constant fear had been worth it. The work didn't end with the destruction of the spy ring. There were other networks, other operations, other enemies to identify. Margaret continued her assignments throughout the war, photographing gatherings and events, watching for signs of betrayal, documenting the evidence that would lead to arrests and trials. She was sent to England in 1943, where she photographed American units preparing for the invasion of France. She was in Normandy in the weeks after D-Day, documenting the liberation of French villages while simultaneously watching for signs of collaborators and enemy agents. She was in Paris when it was liberated, her camera capturing both the joy of freedom and the bitter aftermath of occupation. Through it all, her father's old Graflex camera remained her constant companion. It had photographed 2 wars now, had documented humanity at its worst and sometimes at its best. The brass was more tarnished, the leather more cracked, but the camera still worked perfectly, still captured the images that mattered. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Margaret was in London when the announcement came, and she stood in Trafalgar Square with thousands of others, listening to the church bells ring and watching people dance and cry and embrace strangers. She took photographs, of course, because that's what she did, what she had always done. But for once, the photographs weren't about uncovering secrets or identifying enemies. They were simply about joy, about the moment when a nightmare finally ended. Thomas came home in June, thinner than she remembered, with scars both visible and invisible. They didn't talk much about the war at first. What was there to say? They had both seen things that couldn't be explained to someone who hadn't been there, had both carried burdens that couldn't be shared. But slowly, over weeks and months, they began to find their way back to each other, to the relationship they had before Pearl Harbor had torn their world apart. Margaret reopened her studio in Georgetown in the fall of 1945. The world had changed, and she had changed with it. The young woman who had stood behind her counter on that December morning in 1941, developing wedding photographs and worrying about her future, seemed like someone from another lifetime. That woman had been innocent, naive, unaware of the darkness that humans were capable of inflicting on each other. The woman who returned to that studio in 1945 knew better. She had seen betrayal and courage, evil and heroism, had learned that the line between them was thinner than most people realized. She had learned that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things, both terrible and wonderful. And she had learned that sometimes the most important work was the work that could never be acknowledged, the victories that could never be celebrated, the sacrifices that would remain forever secret. Her father's camera sat on the shelf behind her counter, and sometimes customers would comment on it, ask why she didn't upgrade to something more modern. She would smile and say it was sentimental value, that it had belonged to her father. That was true as far as it went. But the real truth, the truth she could never tell, was that this camera had helped win a war, that its seemingly obsolete design had been the perfect disguise, had allowed her to be dismissed and underestimated, had enabled her to capture images that more sophisticated equipment never could. The file on Operation Torch and the spy ring remained classified for decades. Margaret never spoke about her wartime work, not even to Thomas, who suspected but never asked. She simply went back to photographing weddings and graduations and smiling families, went back to the ordinary life she had once taken for granted. But she was never quite able to forget those years, those moments when she had stood in the shadows with her camera and watched human nature reveal itself in all its complexity. She thought often about the 22 people she had helped identify, about the lives they had lived before they became traitors. Had they started out intending to betray their country, or had they been gradually seduced into it? Had they understood the consequences of their actions, the deaths they would cause? Or had they justified it somehow, convinced themselves that they were serving a greater good? These were questions without answers, mysteries that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she had learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that some things could never be fully understood. All she could do was continue forward, carrying the weight of what she knew, what she had done, what she had witnessed. The photographs she had taken during the war remained in government files, locked away from public view. Most people would never know they existed, would never understand the story they told. But Margaret knew. She remembered every face, every moment, every betrayal she had documented. The images might be hidden, but the truth they revealed would stay with her always. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Margaret received a letter. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Your service to your country has not been forgotten. 22 arrests led to the prevention of multiple intelligence breaches and the likely saving of thousands of lives. Thank you for your courage and dedication. Colonel J. Richardson, U.S. Army Intelligence, retired. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then carefully burned it, watching the paper curl and blacken in her kitchen sink. The acknowledgement meant something, but it also frightened her. These were secrets that were supposed to remain buried forever. Even this small recognition felt like a risk, like opening a door that should stay closed. But she kept the ashes, mixed them with soil, and planted a rose bush in the small garden behind her studio. It bloomed every spring, deep red flowers that seemed to glow in the sunlight. She never told anyone what it represented, this living memorial to secrets that could never be shared. But every time she looked at it, she remembered. She remembered the weight of her camera, the smell of the darkroom chemicals, the faces of the people she had helped identify. She remembered the fear and the determination, the long nights and the moral complexities, the terrible knowledge that doing the right thing often meant causing pain. She grew older, her hands less steady, her eyesight not quite as sharp. She trained her brother's daughter in photography, passed on the technical skills but not the other knowledge, the darker lessons about human nature and the price of security. Some burdens shouldn't be inherited. The Graflex camera remained on its shelf, gathering dust. Its brass fittings now green with age, its leather bellows cracked beyond repair. Margaret could have restored it, could have brought it back to working condition, but she left it as it was, a monument to a specific moment in time, to a war that had demanded everything and given back only the knowledge that she had done what needed to be done. In 1967, on a cold December morning not unlike the one when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Margaret sat in her studio and thought about the passage of time, about how quickly the world had moved forward while the past remained frozen in those old photographs. The young people she photographed now had no memory of the war, no understanding of what it had cost. They lived in a different world, one shaped by the sacrifices of people they would never know, protected by victories they couldn't comprehend. She wondered sometimes if she should try to tell the story, to find some way to share what she had experienced without breaking the oaths she had taken. But she always came back to the same conclusion. Some stories weren't hers to tell. The 22 people she had helped identify had families, lives that had continued even after the trials and imprisonment. Their children and grandchildren lived under the shadow of that betrayal, carrying shame for crimes they hadn't committed. Why add to that burden by making it public? And so Margaret Eleanor Hayes kept her secrets. She photographed her customers, developed their film, helped them preserve their memories while keeping her own locked away. She was just an ordinary woman with an old camera, and that was exactly how she wanted to be remembered. The truth about what she had done, about the lives she had saved and conspiracies she had helped unravel, remained hidden in classified files, known only to a handful of people who were themselves sworn to secrecy. She died in 1978, at the age of 69, in the same studio where she had heard the news about Pearl Harbor 37 years earlier. Her brother Thomas found her there, slumped over her counter, a peaceful expression on her face. Next to her was a photograph she had been developing, a young couple getting married, their faces full of hope and joy. The funeral was small, attended by family and a few longtime customers. No one from military intelligence came. No one acknowledged her wartime service. As far as the world knew, she had been simply a photographer, a woman who had documented ordinary lives in ordinary times. But among her possessions, Thomas found something curious. Hidden in a locked drawer in her darkroom was a single photograph, carefully preserved, showing a man standing in a window, his reflection captured in the glass, his hand moving in a deliberate pattern. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, was a date, October 15, 1942. Thomas stood looking at that photograph for a long time, understanding without being told what it represented. His sister had been part of something important, something she had never been able to share. He thought about destroying the photograph, about maintaining the secrecy she had protected for so long. But in the end, he couldn't do it. This single image was proof that she had mattered, that her life had been more than what it seemed. He placed the photograph back in the drawer, locked it, and took the key with him. If someone ever came looking for it, if the story could ever be told, the evidence would be there. But until then, Margaret's secrets would remain exactly that. Secrets. The Graflex camera sat on its shelf in the studio, and eventually, the building was sold, the equipment dispersed. Someone bought the camera at an estate sale, probably thinking it was just a vintage curiosity, a piece of photographic history. They had no idea what that camera had witnessed, what role it had played in winning a war, how it had been the perfect disguise for uncovering one of the most significant spy networks of World War II. And that, perhaps, was fitting. The best secrets are the ones that remain hidden, the victories that go uncelebrated, the heroes who are never acknowledged. Margaret Eleanor Hayes understood that. She had lived it, had chosen it, had accepted that her contribution to history would remain invisible. But invisible doesn't mean meaningless. The thousands of soldiers who landed safely on the beaches of North Africa in November 1942, the operations that succeeded because their secrets remained secure, the lives that continued because betrayals were discovered and stopped, all of that was real. Margaret's work had mattered, even if no one would ever know. In the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. Because that's what courage sometimes looks like. Not glory and recognition, but quiet determination, unacknowledged sacrifice, the willingness to carry secrets that can never be shared. Margaret Hayes, the woman with the old camera, had understood that truth. She had lived it every day from December 1941 until her death in 1978. And now, decades later, as the classified files begin to be declassified, as historians piece together the hidden stories of World War II, her contribution is finally being recognized. The spy ring she helped dismantle, the lives she helped save, the courage she demonstrated day after day in the shadows, all of it is finally coming to light. She never sought recognition. She never wanted glory. She simply did what needed to be done, with an old camera and a steady hand, proving that the most powerful weapon in war isn't always the most obvious one. Sometimes it's just a woman who sees what others miss, who has the courage to document the truth, and who understand that real heroism often means accepting that you'll never be thankful for what you've done. Margaret Eleanor Hayes died believing her story would never be told. But stories have a way of surviving, even when we think they're buried forever. And her story, the story of the woman who exposed 22 Nazi spies with nothing but her father's old camera and her own determination, deserves to be told. It deserves to be remembered, because her courage, her sacrifice, her willingness to serve in the shadows represent something essential about the human spirit. The capacity to do what's right even when no one is watching, even when there will be no reward, even when the cost is carrying secrets and burdens that can never be shared. If you've stayed with this story until the end, if Margaret's journey has touched you the way it touched me when I first uncovered it in those old classified files, would you do something for me? Leave a comment saying for Margaret, not for me, not for the algorithm, but for her, for the woman who gave years of her life to protect others and never asked for anything in return. Let's create a digital memorial for someone who deserves to be remembered. And if you found value in this story, if it made you think differently about the hidden heroes of history, about the sacrifices that go unrecognized, about the courage that exists in ordinary people, I'd be grateful for your like. It tells me that this work matters, that bringing these forgotten stories to light is worth the research and the effort. We have more stories like this, more hidden chapters of history that deserve to be told, more women whose courage changed the world but whose names were never in the history books. If you want to hear them, if you want to be part of honoring these forgotten heroes, there's another story waiting for you. Just click to the next video, and let's continue this journey together, discovering the truth about the people who shaped our world from the shadows.